Welcome to Charity Chat Canada, the podcast that explores charity issues in all the subsectors of the greater charity world. Our goal is to explore the issues facing this dynamic and thoughtful sector so that others in the greater kindness community can learn and help each other better tackle our common challenges. Charity Chat Canada is hosted by Adam Aptowitzer, a charity lawyer practicing out of Ottawa. To learn more about Adam and this podcast, please visit charitychat.ca. You can also find a link to Adam's latest book, A Legal Guide to Running a Charity in Canada.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Charity Chat Canada. We're the show that explores issues of concern and interest to the various subsectors of the charity world in Canada and abroad. We're very pleased today to welcome Ms. Hilary Pearson of the Advisory Committee to the Government of Canada. But before involvement in the Advisory Committee, Hilary was the president of Philanthropic Foundations Canada, a national network of grant-making organizations in Canada with 135 members, including many of the largest private charitable foundations in the country. Prior to joining PFC, Ms. Pearson held senior positions in central agencies of the Government of Canada, and she was vice president of the Royal Bank of Canada as well. She's an expert in nonprofit governance and has served on several national nonprofit boards of directors, including those of Pearson College of the Pacific, Imagine Canada, the Stratford Shakespeare Festival, Care Canada, and Inspire. She chairs the advisory body, that is, of the Coady Institute at St. Francis Xavier University, and is a member of the advisory council to the master's program in philanthropy and nonprofit leadership at Carleton. She holds a BA and an MA from the University of Toronto and honorary doctorates from Carleton and the University of New Brunswick. Hilary Pearson, hello and welcome.
Thank you very much, Adam. Pleased to be here.
Well, we're very happy to have you. Why don't we start off with a discussion of what exactly is the Advisory Committee on the Charitable Sector?
Sure. It's a new committee that was established by the federal government, by the Minister of Finance and the Minister of Revenue Canada this year. And it hasn't really met yet. It has had one inaugural meeting, but our work's been interrupted, of course, by the recent federal election campaign. And there's been some delay since the new government was elected. While we waited for the cabinet to be appointed, we now know that we have the Minister of Revenue Canada, Madame Le Boutillier, back with us. She's returning as minister in the same portfolio, and she was part of the establishment of this committee back in the spring of 2019.
Okay, great. One thing that struck me when I heard about the Advisory Committee is that it seems to be a continuation of the committees that were discontinued by the Harper government back in, I guess, about 2008 or so. It brings up the question of why, in fact, was this Advisory Committee reconstituted?
Well, that's a very good question. And in fact, ironically, I was part of that original advisory committee, which was set up as part of a response by the federal government to the recommendations made in the voluntary sector initiative, which lasted, as you know, from 2000 to 2005. So that period of time was the last time, really, that we've had any extended and structured conversation between the charitable sector and the federal government across a range of issues. That all came about because a group of federal ministers in the government of Jean Chrétien decided that it was important to pay attention in a systematic way, in a comprehensive way, to the issues in the relationship between the charitable sector and the federal government. And the voluntary sector initiative set up a series of joint tables, one of which was a joint table on regulatory issues. And coming out of that joint table, the government agreed to set up a permanent, we thought at the time, a permanent advisory committee to the Canada Revenue Agency that would provide a platform or a vehicle for continuing conversations even after the formal part of the voluntary sector initiative was over in 2005. You're right, the Harper government did decide in its first year to abolish that committee. So it really didn't have more than about a year or two to operate. And the reason at the time that was given was that the government was looking to, I remember this phrase well, cut the fat. I certainly didn't consider this advisory committee to be something that one could term the fat of government. I thought it was a very helpful and continuing vehicle for conversation and dialogue between the sector and the federal government on a wide range of issues, but many of them to do with regulation, since this was an advisory committee to Revenue Canada. So when that committee was abolished, the only remaining vehicle we had as a sector to talk to the CRA on an ongoing basis was the so-called Technical Issues Working Group, which managed to fly under the radar of the ARPA government, and which, as its name suggests, really was very technically oriented. Many of the representatives on that working group over the years have been lawyers and people working on the accounting side to help manage the work of charities, or to advise on the work of charities. And the CRA Charities Directorate did use that working group, I think, quite effectively to test ideas about its policies and its guidance documents. But it was never intended to be a group that would rise to a higher level, if you will, a level of policy discussion. And policy discussion that inevitably overlaps into the policy work of the Department of Finance. And we can talk about that further if you like. I think that this is an important area that we should now be going into in this new advisory committee on the charitable sector.
I would agree with you wholeheartedly. Well, then I guess the obvious question then is it the intention of the committee or even part of the mandate to produce one big report, or is it to provide an ongoing advisory role for the sector generally?
To my mind, and I believe this is stated in the mandate of the committee, which is public. The Canada Revenue Agency has put together a web page on the committee and on its members, and has published the mandate. And I do believe that the government intends this as a vehicle for ongoing conversation between the sector and both the regulator, the agency itself, and the legislative policymaker, that is the Department of Finance. So while the mandate itself is framed at a fairly general level, I think it's done in that way so that it makes room for a number of issues that we may want to raise. And I also see this committee as being a two-way street, not just between us on the committee and officials in the government, but also for us in the sector who are on this committee and the organizations and charities that we work with. So we are going to go back out to the sector to consult with them and to advise them and to communicate with them about how the agency and the policymaker, the Department of Finance, are thinking about the laws and regulations affecting charities. And we will be able to bring that back, I hope, to the regulator and to the policymaker. It's going to be an interesting challenge to run that two-way street, but I think it's very important in this day and age that there be as much transparency as possible and as much free flow of communication back and forth as possible. This is not intended to be a lobbying exercise. Presumably, lobbying will continue. Different sector organizations always have specific issues that they want to raise with different government departments, and that will continue. And if there is a lot of lobbying, then of course you have to register as a lobbyist. When I say a lot, I mean if there's a lot of time taken by a sector organization in putting forward a particular point of view or a change that they want to see happen. But that kind of work is going to happen outside of and in a complementary way to what we do on this advisory committee. We are advising the Minister of Revenue Canada, but the membership of the committee does include senior representatives of the Department of Finance. And I think that at various points, this committee may well want to make some recommendations or to give some advice to the minister, which is also advice directed at the Minister of Finance and which ideally would be public.
Well, I guess this raises a question regarding why we need to do it in a formal way. It seems to me that over the past years, particularly when there was no committee, the sector was making submissions on a regular basis.
Yep.
People, at the very least in the pre-budget period, when invitations were made to the sector, to all of Canada, to make whatever submissions they would like, and of course there's no barrier to anybody writing a letter to the minister and making suggestions. And certainly the leadership of the charities world makes it clear that they're consistently making these kind of representations to government, even without the committee. And I presume the same is true to the Charities Director and Department of Finance directly, if not by lobbyists, then by those that aren't lobbyists with any particular interest, except to have a well-functioning system. So I guess I'm back at the question then. Why do we need the committee if we can do those kind of submissions directly? And I don't want you to take this in any way to be a doubt on on having a committee. I think it's a wonderful idea, but it does lend, if the idea is to make these representations when they're happening anyways, what's the additional value of having the committee?
Right. Well, that's a very good question as well. It's perhaps important to go back to the genesis of the committee, and it did come out of a response by the federal government to the discussions that happened over a period of 3 to 4 years between 2015 and 2019 around the question of political activities of charities. So as you know, the Liberal Party in its election platform before 2015 had said that it would, if elected, stop the harassment of charities for political activities. And of course, this arose out of the activities of certain environmental charities who have been engaging in public conversations and discussions around the construction of pipelines. This is, of course, still a very live issue, but the question of whether charities could engage in so-called political activities was a very hot question. Arguably, it still is a very hot question, as we see from what's going on in Alberta right now. But what the federal government did in 2015, once it was elected, was to set up a consultation panel on the political activities of charities. And that consultation panel, which was made up of 5 people from the sector, and including Susan Mannering of Miller Thompson, was a panel that I think over a period of time was able to hold hearings, take in submissions, formulate a position, make a recommendation to the Minister of Finance and the Minister of Revenue Canada, which set the agenda essentially for federal government action to reformulate the way in which it described, again, political activities. So that structure, that vehicle of the consultation panel, I think demonstrated how over a period of time, a structured body like that can conduct consultations, reach out to a broad range of people and organizations, collect opinions, formulate a view, and then provide advice that the Minister of Revenue Canada can then use, knowing that there is broad support across the sector for what has been discussed. What we have now is a situation in which we have, rather than political activities, we have public policy dialogue and development activities. And that, of course, was a change made in 2019 when the Minister of Finance announced an amendment to the Income Tax Act to remove the word political and to describe these activities as public policy dialogue and development activities. He also made a very encouraging statement about the federal government's view on the legitimacy and importance of charities engaging in public policy discussion and dialogue. And the creation of this advisory committee was a token also of that view. So not only built on the model of the consultation panel, which had worked well, but also to give more solidity, I guess, to this view that the charitable sector should be engaged in discussions around public policies, and certainly engaged in discussions around public policies affecting the sector directly and affecting the framework within which the sector has to operate. So, as I said earlier, I think that the lobbying activities can be complementary and will continue, but I think this committee should be value added, should be in addition and go beyond the lobbying activities, because it can take a broader perspective, it can take it over a longer period of time, it can consult with a wide range of perspectives and bring those to bear. There are 17 people on this committee who are chosen from across the sector and from regions, from different parts of the sector, some with technical expertise, some with grassroots organization expertise and knowledge, some with connections to networks. This group of people was put together carefully, I think, in order to bring as much input to the table as possible, but also in a way that would allow us as a group to formulate recommendations that would have wide support. So I can see this as a very valuable tool for the government, and it is something that can be used in an ongoing way. Lobbying and submissions to parliamentary committees and briefs will be going in all the time, but this vehicle is more than just a way to provide additional briefs. It really is a way to collect input, have solid and ongoing conversations that lead to solid policy recommendations.
So part of the idea then would be to solicit the opinions of interested people from across Canada, perhaps as well some of the academic research that's done, and then use that information to present a unified set of recommendations from the panel. Is that fair to say?
Yeah. I mean, the word unified, sometimes can we have consensus? Will there be complete unity on the recommendations we make? I hope so, but I can't say that for sure. It is a very diverse sector. We will have to pick the issues that we work on fairly carefully, and the work that we are doing in the next couple of weeks, we are meeting as a committee for the first time in person in the middle of December, and that work will be very important in terms of deciding which priorities are we going to work on, how are we going to work on them, making sure that the priorities we pick are ones that we feel are of interest to a wide range of organizations in the sector. And we have some recommendations from the special committee of the Senate, which looked at the charitable sector over the course of the last year from 2018 to 2019. That special committee heard from over 300 witnesses. They had many, many briefs. It was a very comprehensive look at the issues affecting the charitable sector. And certainly they are more than just issues around regulation. They were issues to do with data, with human resources, with capital and access to capital. And all of the discussion was reflected in a report, a very comprehensive report they put out in June of 2019 with about 40 recommendations. Some of those recommendations were aimed at the advisory committee because the Senate committee saw the advisory committee as being the ongoing vehicle that would take these recommendations forward into a dialogue with the federal government. We have to decide how we address those recommendations, whether there are some that are in the sort of top 3 or 4 priorities that we need to work on. And then we are going to be able, I hope, to report back in a regular way to the sector on how the dialogue, how the conversation is evolving with the regulator.
Interesting, very interesting. One of the questions I had about the committee was clearly its I think its full name is, it's an advisory committee on the charitable sector, but
Right.
it has representatives from the CRA and the Department of Finance, but
Yeah.
it doesn't have representatives from other departments which may touch on basically subsectors of the charity world, such as environment or health or multiculturalism,
Hmm.
heritage. Um, is the committee is it part of the committee to provide advice into those areas as well?
Well, I think that because this is the only platform we have as a sector right now, it's inevitable that some of these other issues that are not regulatory issues but are very important to the sector, and I mentioned them earlier, access to capital, access to government programs that support technological investments for charities, business planning services for charities, all of the sort of data services that we have not had for a very long time, because Statistics Canada has cut back on many of the surveys that it has done in the past of the sector, which has meant that the sector has become invisible. Without data, you are not visible, and you are not visible to policymakers. That is a real concern for us, I think, as a sector. It can't be dealt with, I believe, through an advisory committee to the Minister of Revenue Canada, but because it's the only structure that we have at this point, it's inevitable that some of these issues will come up. One of the things that came up repeatedly during the Senate special committee hearings was this question of a home in government for the charitable sector. It was a question that was posed often by the senators. There were different responses to that from the sector, but I think there was unanimity on the view that because the charitable sector does not have a single point of focus in the federal government, in other words, a dedicated unit that's focused on infrastructure and relationship issues for between the sector and the federal government, it's really been difficult to move forward with coherent infrastructural policies. And we continue, and I say we, the sector more broadly, we continue to insist on having this home in government. It is a key recommendation of the Senate committee. Whether it is best placed in a central agency like the Privy Council Office, or whether it should be in a department, whether there should be a minister with a portfolio for the charitable sector. These are questions that we would like the government to consider. It certainly has happened in other countries, in the United Kingdom and in Australia and in New Zealand. There have been ministers with specific portfolios dedicated to the charitable sector and therefore able to make policy outside of a tax and regulation framework. But right now, the only unit that is focused on charities is inside the Canada Revenue Agency, and it is the Charities Directorate. And that is problematic for us because it means that policy is made through a tax lens and not through a broader infrastructural or sort of sector development lens. We are an economic sector. We're not just a a voluntary sector. In fact, most of us don't want to be called the voluntary sector. That nomenclature doesn't work for us. We are an economic sector in that we contribute to GDP. We have over 2 million jobs in the sector. By some measures, we contribute something like 8% of the GDP of this country. We deserve to be seen by the federal government as an important contributor to the economy as well as to society. And we deserve to have infrastructural policies that support the growth and the flourishing of the sector. Well, we don't have any of that yet. So in the meantime, this advisory committee on the charitable sector is going to fill the gap. And to go back to your question, I think it's inevitable that we will probably there will be some pressure on us, and we may well want to bring forward some issues around, say, more and better federal data collection, or more flexible and nimble grants and contributions measures or regimes, less restrictive accountability regimes, more direct support for human resources and for technology investments. That will probably come to the table. And we may hear from the Charities Directorate that they can't deal with that. But I think the idea of having other departments represented perhaps at our meetings, I think is a good one. And I would hope that beyond the Department of Finance that we do see some other representatives.
And on a personal note, I would hope to see the provinces represented as well. I doubt that can happen. It's always difficult to get 10 children to agree on anything with the parents, but
Yes.
but as you know, constitutionally,
Yes.
the governance of charities is actually a provincial jurisdiction, and so I
Yes,
think
that's quite
it's
true.
my opinion, at least, that in order to move forward, we really need to involve them because they're the ones with the constitutional authority to do so. But absent that, it is the federal government and the Charities Directorate specifically that has stepped into the role of regulators of the charity sector. And
Yes.
certainly, this committee is going to be an important way to present our opinions as a unified group to them. So, I guess on behalf of the charity sector, thank you for taking on that role. That's as co-chair, you're going to have a big job ahead of you, and we'll look forward to hearing invitations for submissions. And I'm sure that you'll be very active in spreading the word. So I'm looking forward to hearing more about it.
I certainly will be very active, I think, Adam, and I appreciate the opportunity you've given me to talk about it and to set out some of the priorities and the issues that we would like to address. Maybe I'll make a final comment that relates to your interest in the provinces being involved or more active in charity regulation. Yes, we do live in a federation. Yes, the provinces do have a constitutional responsibility. I would love for the provinces to agree with the federal government on perhaps the promulgation of a federal Charities Act. We would have to have federal and provincial agreement to that, but a Charities Act, in other words, a separate statute that would govern the definition and the regulation of the charitable sector and take it out of the purview of the Income Tax Act might be a very interesting solution to some of the difficulties that we've had with the Income Tax Act and the federal government in the past. That's maybe the the long term, the holy grail, the impossible dream. But I think having the provinces engage with us in that kind of effort would be wonderful indeed.
Well, we can always live in hope. We'll leave it at that, and I'll look
Okay.
forward to hearing more from the committee, and perhaps at a later date we'll get you back on to tell us a little bit more about the work the committee is doing up to that point.
Sure, with pleasure.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Charity Chat Canada. Please visit our website, charitychat.ca, where you'll find show notes, related articles and links, and details on how to contact us and where to find our episodes. Until next time.